My name is Michael Brooks. I was the curator for a conference called Learning 2030, which was a summit on the future of education convened by the Waterloo Global Science Initiative, which is a Canadian not-for-profit organisation which focuses on kind of taking on big societal issues. Next to me, I have Susan Opok, who is the Uganda Country Director for Promoting Equality in African Schools, or PEAS, which is an NGO that works to give all African children access to affordable, high-quality secondary education. And also Sam Levin, who was the founder of the Independent Project at Monument Mountain Regional High School in Massachusetts, which allowed students to form a school within a school where those who wanted to could follow a self-directed curriculum. And Sam is currently an undergraduate at Oxford University. So Susan and Sam were two of the 48 or so experts that we assembled in Waterloo in Ontario late last year for the summit. We represented a total of 6 continents. We had a range of expertise and experience. 18-year-olds, recent school leavers, right through to academics who'd worked for decades in education, people who'd re-engineered their own education, teacher trainers, curriculum experts. And we were there really, I locked them in a room for 3 days effectively and said, tell me everything that you know, write it all down, and let's synthesize it all. And the idea was that we channel their insights into the creation of a strategy that would address the problems of inequity, both in access to education and in the outcomes of education. Our only assumption being that every child that's born into the world has equal potential for learning. And clearly, when you look at the statistics for the outcomes of education, it's very different and very context dependent, depending on where you are and how you are, where you are in the world, and what systems are in place to educate you. So. I'm going to hand over to Susan now. She's going to talk about some of the motivations behind the summit, and then Sam will talk about some of the conclusions that we came to.
Before I talk about the motivations, I'll just talk briefly about PEAS. PEAS is a social enterprise, charity, not-for-profit, and our mission is virtually to support children in high school, secondary school. We believe that every child has a potential and would like to unlock that potential. In Uganda, we have 24 schools in rural Uganda because we believe that the children in the cities, in the townships, have better education. So we're trying to see how quality education can be taken to the rural areas. We also have 2 schools in Zambia, and we are soon to open up in Rwanda. Actually, last year we won the WISE Awards, which was really motivational because of our work. We operate using a smart aid model, trying to move away from the traditional aid systems where sponsorship is given to children, but including children and parents in the education system so that everyone is involved. So briefly, because of that, I participated in the Equinox Summit, and the motivation for the summit was to ensure that we do not continue to waste the potential of young people and the generation of children that is. As previously stated by the speaker that was, you find that almost 65 million children are out of school. And if you see that in 2 out of 3 countries in the world, girls especially do not get the education that they should get. And you find that boys are more advantaged because of a lot of other factors, socioeconomic factors. In my network of schools, we've been trying to see that girls actually attain education. And for people who work in the developing world, we may know that African girls, Asian girls are often disadvantaged for various reasons, as said by the previous speaker. And that is just part of the problem. Across the world, you find that 31 million children have dropped out of school, and they may never go back or return due to the opportunities that aren't available to them. In South and West Asia, we find that 52% of the kids are illiterate. 22% of these come from sub-Saharan Africa. If you're born in the wrong region, the wrong part of the world, to the wrong parents, if we may say, it might be an uphill task for that child to go to school or to get an education. Within nations, there is inequality. In the United States, for example, compared with white males, 3 times as many Hispanic young men in the United States are not enrolled or don't have high school diploma. If you look at male 9th graders in the US still, 78% of the white population will graduate in high school in about 4 years, compared to none. And that drops up to about 58% of Latinos and 52% for the blacks students. In Canada, the Aboriginal Canadians aged between 20 and 24 are 3 times less likely to have completed high school compared with non-Aboriginal Canadians or students. Perhaps the most problematic of all this is the general educational divide between the rich and the poor. If you're a child growing up amongst the OECD top earners, your reading age will be a year ahead of students from households with average income, and far further ahead than those from households from the lower incomes.
So the motivation we really saw is that, yes, there are problems with the education, certainly in the developing world, in the global south, but there are also problems all over the world. And it seemed that even in developing countries, there are strategies that are being used to improve these situations massively. So it's a huge problem to try to tackle, but we considered it worth attempting to do so. Especially as the solutions to inequality seem to actually double up as solutions to general issues of disengagement with education wherever you are in the world. So at the moment we have by high school as many as 40 to 60% of all students, that's urban, suburban and rural, are chronically disengaged from school. And so there's this critical mass of knowledge and understanding now about paths out of this problem. And we considered it a good time to focus on solving these issues. So as I said, our methodology was to gather a group of experts and to identify the most effective pathways that are in place already to a better and more equitable outcome for education, and to create something that was applicable, that we could apply, that Susan could take in Uganda, that I could apply in the UK, that could apply wherever you are in the world. So it had to be, it had to work regardless of culture and resources, and really be something that principles that can be used everywhere. We also suggested in the blueprint that we produced, a kind of strategy document, we included implementation pathways, because we're very aware that there have been many reports into education and very many offers of strategies of how you improve things. Very few of those offer ways to actually make the change, to get from here to there, as it were. And what we studied when we looked at the previous sort of offerings of educational reform, we found that actually they hadn't included implementation pathways. And so when you look at the history of their implementation, nobody really knew what to do. And this is one of the major problems. So many of the recommendations that Sam will talk about in a moment, there were very similar things were said in the 1920s or the 1960s. Actually, none of this is new. I would say what we've done is not discovery, but uncovery. In that we've lifted up all the rocks and found what everyone's doing. And everybody's known for decades really how to fix these things, but nobody's really known how to implement these things. So we also included in our blueprint document, which is available from today, free of charge at WGSI.org. We included these implementation pathways and and we talked about issues of scalability and affordability and sustainability in a changing world, of course, because the resources that are around now, the knowledge that is around now, is not necessarily what's going to be around in the next 5 years or 10 years. We live in a very fast changing world. So we don't have time to go into all the details of the blueprint, but what we discovered was that many of the solutions that will solve the problems of inequity in outcome and provision are actually in existence and working on very small scales. It might be a single school somewhere that's doing something. So we attempted to put all these together and sort of work out from them, distill from them a set of strategies, which Sam is now going to run through.
So these are sort of bullet points that are brief intros to the larger things that are discussed in more detail in the blueprint, and they're basically, these are the changes that we feel we need to make to solve all the problems that Susan and Michael just mentioned. So first we need to develop lifelong learners, rather than just students who learn for 4 years and that's it. So these learners need to have a well-rounded base of knowledge, but they also need to have a core set of skills and what we've been calling habits of mind, like curiosity or appreciation of evidence. And they need to experience expertise and mastery in areas that interest them. We also need to implement project-based learning. So these are self-directed, self-selected projects on things that really matter and matter to them. So they're projects that build a balance between knowing and doing, and they enable students to develop both knowledge and skills. We also need to put learners in fluid groupings rather than age-based divisions. So these groupings would be based on goals, experience, expertise, and the capacity for mutual support, rather than just how many years a student has been alive. We talk about having teachers, rather than just imparting knowledge onto their students, being guides and curators of learning. So teachers will be role models for learning, so they'll be carrying out their own research while supporting students with advice, connecting them with sources of information, whether that's a library or an expert in the community or the internet. We need to implement qualitative ongoing assessment. So that's qualitative ongoing assessment rather than high stakes summative assessment. Personalized assessment will be a regular part of the learning process so that students know at all time where their strengths lie, where their weaknesses are, where they can improve, where they're struggling. And assessment can't just be, you can't just use assessment or summative assessment for ranking schools or school district or counties. That isn't helping anyone. And this sort of more ongoing qualitative assessment we see as a better way to move forward. We talk about how decisions are made in these learning structures. So we want strong local inputs on decision making. Decisions about the framework for learning in a local jurisdiction should be made by stakeholder groups that consist of learners, teachers, parents, government bodies, and representatives of the local community. And finally, we want to develop students and teachers that have a mindset that's open to experimentation and failure. And what that means is, education has to be a place where people can take risks, try something new, learn how to create, innovate, refine, and apply knowledge and skills in a way that develop minds that are both adventurous but also resilient when they face failures and are able to fail in a way that they can move forward and grow from it rather than being afraid of it. So, like I said, and like Michael said, these are sort of bullet points that are explored in much more detail. As Michael said, we were locked in a room for many days. we produced a lot of material. And as Michael said, those can be found in the blueprint online, and in part of our blueprint was creating room for further innovation in what we call the living blueprint, which is all online, I believe, at learning2030.
Yeah, learning2030.org.
And the idea is for educators, students, experts, people, to be able to contribute to this document and make it a living thing that can grow and change. And of course, the things we're proposing will raise a lot of questions. Some of these, or many of these, are answered in the blueprint, I believe, and many of these will prompt further discussion because we are talking about changes to an existing structure. And I don't have time I think we don't have time to get into all those, but I just want to preempt two of the most common responses to some of the changes we're talking about. First, there's often skepticism about the motivation of students. So the question of whether they'll just slack off in the kind of learning environment we're proposing. But first, you should remember that according to the statistics that we cited earlier about disengagement and lack of enrollment, there's a lot of slacking off already, and that's been my experience as well. But more importantly, as Michael said, I founded a school within a school that was run by students, and what I saw was exactly the opposite. Young people, and especially high schoolers, are starving for real responsibility and real agency. And when you give them, when you start to hand over the reins, when you give them that responsibility, that's when they become most engaged and most passionate. And what you see when that happens can be really remarkable. And second, on the issue of assessment, you'll have heard that we mentioned switching from these sort of high-stakes summative assessment that we're so used to more ongoing throughout the system and process, sort of qualitative assessment. Obviously, if you're not giving a grade at the end of the thing, things have to change in terms of post-secondary requirements, post-secondary admissions processes. So the good news is that many higher education institutions and employers are already starting to recognize that traditional grades and exam scores are not a good indicator of what they're getting from their incoming students or employees. And they're finding alternative assessment tools such as portfolios of work, detailed teacher assessment of skills, and they're finding that those are a better guide. And I think some of the top places or employers like Google are already starting to use these kind of things. And in fact, where we are today, the University of Oxford, they make their final decision about which students get in based on a rigorous set of interviews where they decide by measuring the student rather than some exam score.
I want to emphasize that these are, although they seem like quite prosaic points in some ways, we're not talking about some kind of amazing technological innovation or something. They're almost allowing teachers to be good teachers and not just deliverers of content, and finding ways in which to allow students to remain engaged and do stuff that's actually of interest to them. But these kinds of small shifts really are able to make significant impact. We've seen, and there are case studies within the blueprint of where they're happening in single schools and they make enormous differences to the outcomes of education, and that's regardless of kind of resources and context, really. So I wanted to come back to Susan and just say, ask you to explain how these kinds of changes will increase engagement in your schools or in rural Uganda. I mean, you believe that this is actually a step forward?
Thank you, Michael. I think the introduction of innovative pedagogy keeps learners engaged, and this is particularly for girls, looking at our kind of settings. Because girls get disengaged from education very easily. The issue is how can we keep them engaged in the classroom, in the school? How can we keep their environment safe? How can we ensure that as they move out of school that they are safe, and so on and so forth? So this should be innovative ways both in and out of the classroom. We should look at using resources that don't really need, that are not very expensive. How can we utilize local resources that can support the teaching and learning processes? Curriculum can be adapted to suit local needs. And this also still requires creativity on the parts of teachers, policymakers, and how can we move away from the traditional way of thinking and say exploring new technologies, appropriate technology that can help set curriculum that are relevant to the students. And it also requires good teacher training. And this is an aspect which is quite challenging in our situation. For the teachers, there's a feeling that there is too much work for them and yet little pay. So how can we motivate, how can we include the teachers in all that is happening and make them feel that it is worthwhile and that they are recognized for their work? And this is part of the processes that my organization, PEACE, is trying to do through aspects like continuous professional development, ensuring that the education team is in class and working with and supporting the teachers. Thank you.
Really just want to encourage you to pick up a copy of the blueprint or download a copy of the blueprint. We've even got it I think on flash drives at the back, so if you want to take it there's PDFs. And we'll conclude there and take any questions and feedback as well that you have, please. I mean, I've met so many people here who are already doing things like this. The issue is scaling. Often, you have to do it in a way that's scalable. If you want a school district or a ministry to take these things up, but there's a school district in Canada, in British Columbia, the Surrey district, is already in the process of abandoning letter grades. So these things are already happening. What we're seeing is a gradual shift, and I think the more these things are talked about, the more people will take them up. And the kinds of innovations that we're talking about, you may not even notice them happening, but what we're hoping is that in 15 years' time, everything will have been in place and nobody noticed that it was at all painful. Because I don't think it has to be painful. Yeah.
So with your Ugandan experience, what sort of government buy-in do you have? Because I know that certainly in Nigeria there's a very strong reluctance to move away from exam grading.
I think the government is thinking about changing the curricula, and various aspects of the education system. And I think as my organization has worked with government, they've kind of bought into what we are doing. As an example, they've come and said, can you come and help us manage some schools because of your kind of management system? So I mean, it's not that we are doing something very new, but we are trying to put accountability, community engagement, and other aspects within the school system so that everyone is involved in what's happening. So there seems to be a buy-in into what we are doing. However, there is also a reluctance in terms of, oh, how much will it cost? So we are trying to prove that probably what we are doing could be cheaper than what government is doing in the government-aided schools.
What are the critical ways to implement these things? You know, what are the blockages that we need to remove? What are the new mechanisms, whether be they institutional or financial, that will enable those kind of reforms to take place? If we know what's doing, what might work, why isn't it happening?
So we've been in meetings with Ministry of Education personnel who know what works and are kind of planning to go there, but they proceed very slowly. So the last 3 chapters of the blueprint are actually sort of 2 chapters about implementation pathways, what's worked in the past. And we looked at the example of Finland. It's not necessarily that you want to get to the same system as Finland, but they were very canny in the way that they implemented change over several decades, in fact. And the thing you need is a certain amount of buy-in. You need a cohort of people from various levels of ministry, school district, principals and teachers. You need to assemble this kind of critical mass of people who are going to take on this role of being change makers effectively in the process. And then, I mean, there's plenty of sort of business literature about change in organizations, and it applies very much here in education. One of the problems that we found is that people don't talk to each other in education at all. So we would go to a ministry here and say, oh, this ministry here is doing that as well, but they might be 18 months ahead of you. You should talk to them because they can accelerate your progress. And so you need the buy-in from people. You need people to all be kind of recognizing that this needs to happen. Because until that happens, you can't, you're just fighting sort of within the system. But once you get this kind of recognition that provision for ethnic minorities or for Aboriginal people in your country isn't really working and things aren't really working, change does need to happen. And I think most of the ministry personnel that we came across completely agreed with that and have bought into it almost years ago. They just don't know how to do it. And so what we've attempted to do is just sort of show the pathway of how you do it. And it's really assembling a critical mass of people, following a plan, outlining what your vision is, communicating your vision to parents, through the media as well. And there are sort of various steps that you can take, and you have to make sure that you're following them, because if you go off that track, which so many reform ideas have done, they founder very quickly.